Welcome to the deep dive. You've given us a fantastic set of sources, all focused on something, well, absolutely key to navigating the constant flow of information we all face: critical thinking. In everyday life, we're
hmm
talking about how to really evaluate the arguments, the opinions, everything coming your way.
That's right. And you've clearly got an interest in really getting to grips with what makes a strong argument and how to spot the weak ones.
Yeah.
Your materials, they range from the basics, the fundamental principles of argumentation, right up to common errors, fallacies, and even some really fascinating examples from the legal world.
Right.
So our mission today, I guess, is to pull out the most useful insights from all this.
Okay.
Practical tools people can immediately use to sharpen their own thinking, make more confident decisions.
Okay, so where do we even begin with this? It feels like a huge topic, but looking at your sources, a really clear first step seems to be, well, whether you're in a debate or just trying to understand someone, it's nailing down the central issue. What are we actually talking about?
It's fascinating how often discussions just go sideways simply because people are arguing about slightly different things. They don't even realize it sometimes.
Mm,
For example, one of your texts, it highlights the difference between asking, say, if coal is a readily available, inexpensive energy source, which, might be true,
okay.
versus the critical question of whether burning coal significantly contributes to global warming.
Ah, I see. Related, but different questions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And answering one doesn't necessarily answer the other. If you're not clear which question you're tackling, the whole discussion can just become unproductive.
Exactly. It's like the difference between a detective initially exploring if Jin could have been involved in a crime, maybe motive, opportunity, that kind of stuff.
Right. Just exploring possibilities.
And a jury needing proof beyond a reasonable doubt that she actually committed murder. The bar, the question itself, it's completely different.
And this applies in the simplest situations, too. Think about deciding where to eat dinner. Is your main goal saving money?
Or maybe eating health.
Precisely. Or wanting a specific atmosphere. Clarifying those goals, those underlying goals, it fundamentally shapes how you evaluate the choices.
Right?
So as you process information, always start by asking, what's the real question here? What
Yeah.
problem are we actually trying to solve?
All right, so once we're clear on the issue, the next logical step is, well, understanding the arguments being made. Your sources go into the structure of arguments, which is more than just people disagreeing, thankfully.
Yes.
Yep.
There's a method, or there should be.
A method to the madness?
Indeed.
Yeah.
We generally encounter two main types, deductive and inductive arguments.
Okay.
Deductive arguments, they aim for logical certainty. If the starting points of the premises are true and the argument is structured correctly, then the conclusion absolutely must be true.
Like that voting example.
Mhm.
All citizens can vote. You're a citizen, so you can vote.
That's a classic deductive setup. Exactly. It's that if this, then that definitely feeling. They're either valid and sound or they're not. It's kind of black and white.
Okay, sound means it's valid, and the starting points are true.
Correct. Valid structure, true premises. But then we have inductive arguments. They're a bit more about likelihood, right?
Yeah.
Precisely. Inductive arguments deal in probabilities. The premises make the conclusion more or less likely, but they don't guarantee it.
Like the tornado example, Oklahoma has had one every year for ages.
Right, so it's likely they'll have one this year, but, no absolute certainty.
ASAP.
And what's interesting is that inductive arguments exist on a spectrum, weak to strong. Depends on how well the premises support the conclusion.
So winning the lottery once doesn't make it likely you'll win again tomorrow.
Very weak induction. Yeah,
But maybe years of flu outbreaks in winter make another one probable.
exactly. Much stronger induction. There's a gray area there, unlike the either of deductive arguments.
Okay, so clear questions, different kinds of arguments, deductive certainty, inductive probability. Now, this next part really throws a wrench in how we often think about disagreements. Your sources dive into logical fallacies, those sneaky errors in reasoning.
Mhm. The ones that can make a weak argument sound persuasive.
Let's start with a really common one. Ad hominem, attacking the person.
Yes, this is where someone attacks the person making the argument instead of dealing with the argument itself.
Like the Nixon example, dismissing his ideas on China trade because of, well, Watergate and his reputation.
Exactly. Or ignoring Tiger Woods' views on golf course design because of his personal life. The strength of their argument about trade or golf is separate from their personal history. It's about the reasoning, not the person.
But, and this was a bit surprising to see in your sources, not all attacks on a person are fallacies. When is it actually okay to consider the source?
Yeah, that's a crucial distinction. What's fascinating here is the difference between attacking the substance of an argument and assessing the reliability of the person providing information.
Okay. How so?
Well, if you're on a jury, right, and you're evaluating a witness, pointing out that they have a history of perjury, of lying under oath,
Yeah.
that's not a fallacy.
Because it speaks to their credibility now.
Precisely. It's a direct, relevant challenge to their credibility in this instance. Or, say, hiring someone for a job, handling money. If an applicant has a past conviction for embezzlement,
That's definitely relevant.
it's a legitimate concern about their suitability for that role. The key is whether the attack is relevant to the truth or validity of the specific claim being made right now.
That makes sense. It's context dependent. Like that British court example attacking the lawyer's personal opinion of his client's innocence. That's irrelevant. His job is the legal argument.
Exactly. His feelings don't matter to the legal facts. And think about those jailhouse informants. People offer deals, reduce sentences for testifying against others.
Their testimony is immediately suspect, right?
Right.
Because they have a huge self-interest.
Absolutely. So their credibility is a very valid point of scrutiny. It raises that key question. When a defense attorney questions a witness about lying under oath in a previous case,
Are they committing a fallacy? Or just checking if they're trustworthy now?
your sources suggest the latter. Past dishonesty can be relevant to present reliability. Doesn't automatically mean they're lying now, but it's a fair point to raise for evaluation.
Okay, so ad hominem isn't always a forbidden move. Got it. Now, another fallacy that really twists things is the straw man. This one feels particularly dishonest sometimes.
It often is. The straw man fallacy involves misrepresenting someone else's viewpoint, usually making it simpler or more extreme to make it easier to attack.
Like creating a caricature.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The mobile oil ad you included is a perfect example. It falsely depicted advocates for soft energy, solar, wind conservation.
As wanting everyone to use firewood.
Right. A ridiculous, easily dismissed position. The actual proposals were much more complex, harder to criticize fairly.
Sure.
The key thing is how it just shuts down productive discussion. You end up arguing about something nobody actually proposed.
And the death panel claim during the healthcare debate, that felt like a really damaging straw man. It completely distorted the actual idea about end-of-life care planning.
Hugely damaging.
Yeah.
And you mentioned Barney Frank's reaction to that person with the Obama is Hitler sign. It really highlights how logic sometimes just, well, hits a wall against that kind of deliberate misrepresentation.
Yeah, what can you even say to that?
It raises an important point for, anyone encountering arguments. If someone seems determined to twist your words, to argue against something you never actually said, reasoned discussion becomes very, very difficult. You might have to recognize they aren't engaging in good faith.
We saw other examples too, didn't we? Like exaggerating claims about opponents, people against abortion wanting to ban all birth control.
Right, or gun control advocates wanting to confiscate every single firearm.
It's attacking an extreme, distorted version, not the actual nuanced position. And that Bowers v. Hardwick dissent argued the majority did this too, focusing on a right to commit homosexual sodomy instead of the actual privacy argument.
What's fascinating, and maybe a little scary, about strawman arguments is how effective they can be at polarizing debates. It's much easier to get people riled up against some absurd exaggeration than against a well-supported opposing view.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. Your sources also really hammer home how crucial it is to clearly define the conclusion of an argument. It sounds obvious, but maybe it isn't always.
It can be surprisingly tricky, especially in complex situations like, say, legal cases. Take the term breaking or entering.
Okay.
The precise legal definition of that crime can vary slightly depending on jurisdiction. A juror has to listen very carefully to the judge's instructions on exactly what elements the prosecution needs to prove.
So you need to know exactly what guilty means in this specific context.
Exactly. Without a clear grasp of the specific conclusion being argued for that the defendant committed this specific legal act. With all its defined elements, it's easy to get lost in the evidence or swayed by irrelevant points.
And this came up in one of those exercises you shared about politicians claiming a not guilty verdict proves innocence.
Right, because as the sources point out, not guilty in court just means the prosecution didn't meet that very high standard beyond a reasonable doubt.
It doesn't mean they prove the person didn't do it.
Correct. It's not the same as definitively proving factual innocence. So the politician is drawing a much stronger conclusion than the verdict actually supports, equivocating on the word innocent.
So when evaluating any argument, step one is almost, what exactly is this person trying to convince me of? What's the bottom line?
Exactly. Before you can even start to assess if the reasons are any good, you need absolute clarity on what claim those reasons are supposed to be supporting.
Okay, so be clear on the question, understand the argument type deductive or inductive, watch out for fallacies like ad hominem and strawman, and pin down the exact conclusion. What's another key tool for our critical thinking toolbox?
Well, a really crucial skill, and one that takes practice, is being able to tell the difference between reasons that actually support a conclusion and reasons that are, well, irrelevant, just fluff sometimes.
Just because someone throws a lot of points out there doesn't mean they all hit the target.
Precisely. Your sources gave that good example about legalizing casino gambling. Reasons like creating jobs, generating tax revenue, keeping local money in the community.
Those all seem directly related, right? Pros and cons for the county.
They do seem relevant.
Mhm.
But then contrast that with the Rumpole of the Bailey excerpt, where someone argued Gandolfini's expertise in valuing paintings was relevant to whether a specific painting was beautiful.
Ah, different things. Valuation versus aesthetics.
Exactly. Expertise in market value doesn't automatically make you an expert judge of beauty. Those are different skills, different kinds of knowledge, irrelevant expertise in this context.
And the defense attorney arguing about the defendant's skill with a pistol. That was another clear example.
Right, in a self-defense case. Once it was established, the shooting happened at very close range.
Their marksmanship skill didn't really matter anymore.
Exactly. It became irrelevant to the question of self-defense at that close distance. It might even be inflammatory, distracting the jury by painting the defendant as some kind of gun expert, which doesn't directly address the self-defense claim.
This brings up that interesting point from the Nathan Jackson forgery case in the materials. The defense wanted to ask Professor Winston if he'd let Jackson sign other documents for him. And the prosecution objected, saying it was irrelevant to the charge of forging a letter of recommendation.
And that objection makes sense, right? Allowing someone to sign, say, routine class attendance sheets is a completely different kettle of fish from forging a formal letter of recommendation for grad school. One doesn't imply permission for the other. Relevance is key.
Okay. Now, when we do have multiple relevant reasons supporting the same conclusion, your sources introduce this idea of convergent arguments.
Yes.
This sounds like different pieces of evidence all pointing towards the same answer in a crime investigation.
That's a great way to think about it. In a convergent argument, you have multiple independent reasons. Each one offers separate support for the same conclusion.
So if one reason gets knocked down, the others might still hold up.
Exactly. If one reason turns out to be weak or even incorrect, the other reasons can still stand on their own and provide support for the conclusion. It strengthens the overall case.
So thinking about maybe a work project, if I have several independent reasons backing up my strategy, that gives me more confidence.
It absolutely should. Identifying that kind of convergent support strengthens your case. The example of opposing a nuclear power plant had this structure, right?
Yeah, the potential danger, the burden on future generations, and the argument, it wasn't essential. 3 separate lines of reasoning.
Right. Even if you somehow address the safety concerns, the ethical argument about future generations and the necessity argument would still need tackling independently.
And the Priscilla Prowler burglary trial example showed this clearly, too. The eyewitness description,
Her fingerprints at the scene,
her boyfriend testifying against her.
and the stolen goods found in her apartment.
Right, all separate pieces pointing to guilt. If, say, the boyfriend's testimony was thrown out.
The other pieces of evidence, the fingerprints, the eyewitness, the recovered goods, would still need to be considered. They still converge on her guilt.
Okay, convergent arguments. Now, another really important area your sources touched on was the danger of, well, assumptions. Making assumptions without really thinking them through.
Oh, absolutely. We all do it. But some assumptions can really lead us down the wrong path if they're unexamined or just plain false.
Like the cliche mystery novel, where the detective assumes the killer must be either the Duke or the cook.
Exactly. That assumption blinds them to other possibilities, maybe the unassuming librarian. Or think about a university administrator claiming the only way to fix a budget shortfall is either cut classes or raise tuition.
That's a false dilemma, isn't it? It ignores other options.
It certainly presents one. It ignores possibilities like reducing administrative costs or improving fundraising or other creative solutions. These are unexamined assumptions limiting the available choices.
And that common but totally false assumption in court, that if a defendant doesn't testify, they must be guilty.
That completely flips the script on innocent until proven guilty. Which brings us to the burden of proof. A huge concept, especially in legal settings, as your sources stress.
It seems absolutely fundamental.
It is. The principle is, you're presumed innocent. The prosecution, the accuser, has the burden. They have to present enough evidence to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt.
Right, you don't have to prove you're innocent.
Exactly. And the fallacy of appeal to ignorance tries to reverse this. Arguing something must be true because it hasn't been proven false.
Like saying invisible aliens live in the ocean because no one's proven they don't.
Precisely. It's an absurd shift. You can't just make a claim and demand others disprove it, like Rousseau claiming Marie Antoinette said let him eat cake.
Mm-hmm.
The burden is on him to show she said it, not on others to prove she didn't.
And your sources pointed out how this can mistakenly creep into jury rooms where jurors might think a defendant staying silent is somehow evidence of guilt.
Mm-hmm. Even though the right to remain silent is a fundamental legal protection, not an admission. And it's interesting, the historical shift that allowed defendants to testify, while vital for justice,
Might have unintentionally created an expectation, like, if you're innocent, why wouldn't you testify?
it's possible it contributed to that misunderstanding, yeah. Jurors might incorrectly shift the burden onto the defendant in their minds.
And the burden of proof isn't just legal, right? It plays out elsewhere.
Absolutely. In the debate around, say, physician-assisted suicide, a key question is, who bears the burden of proof regarding the potential societal consequences? Those arguing for it or those arguing against it?
And that case of parents refusing medical treatment for their child, incredibly complex. Who has the burden to prove what's really in the child's best interest? The parents, the doctors, the state.
Exactly. And the Cruzan case your materials mentioned, involving stopping life-sustaining treatment for someone incompetent, the Supreme Court ruled that the state could set a very high burden of proof, requiring clear and convincing evidence of the person's wishes. It highlights how critical burden of proof is.
Okay, now let's talk about something that can muddy the waters even when the logic seems okay. Language itself. Your sources point out how ambiguity can lead to flawed reasoning, maybe without us even noticing.
Oh, definitely. Language is powerful, but slippery. Even defining a simple word like dog, as Quine discussed, gets complicated fast if you push it.
Undetached dog parts.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or the innkeeper example doesn't apply to a steamboat captain offering cabins, or an hourly motel. The meaning shifts and blurs at the edges.
But the real trap seems to be the fallacy of equivocation, using the same word with two different meanings in one argument.
That's the one. It leads to a false conclusion because you've subtly shifted the meaning mid-argument.
Like the politician example again. Declared innocent by a jury, meaning not proven guilty legally.
Right, a specific legal finding.
And then claiming to be innocent in the everyday sense, meaning factually having done nothing wrong.
It's a classic equivocation, using the ambiguity of the word innocent to claim something the verdict didn't actually establish.
So as we're taking in information, we need to really pay attention to how key words are being used. Are they consistent?
Absolutely. Is the meaning stable throughout the argument? Ambiguity can be unintentional sometimes, but it can also be a deliberate tool to mislead. Watch out for those shifts.
Okay. Now, we all rely on experts, right? We can't know everything. So thinking critically about appeals to authority seems vital. Your sources gave some good guidelines here.
Yes, it's crucial. A legitimate appeal to authority needs a few things to be in place. First, the person has to be a genuine expert in the relevant field.
Not just famous or an expert in something else.
Right. Second, there should generally be agreement among other experts in that field on the issue. If the experts are deeply divided, appealing to just one isn't as strong.
Okay.
And third, we need good reason to believe the authority is likely giving a truthful and, importantly, unbiased opinion.
Ah, unbiased. So this connects back to ad hominem, doesn't it? Attacking the credibility or bias of a claimed authority isn't necessarily fallacious.
Exactly. If someone presented as a scientific expert is, say, heavily funded by the very industry their research impacts.
Like tobacco research funded by tobacco companies back in the day.
Precisely. That funding creates a potential bias, and pointing it out is a relevant challenge to their credibility as an unbiased source. It's not an ad hominem fallacy in that context.
The sources mention some groups, like the American Council on Science and Health, getting funding from chemical industries, raising questions about their independence.
Yes. It highlights the problem of potentially biased experts and these seemingly independent foundations that might have hidden agendas. Always wise to, consider the source and follow the money sometimes.
And the classic image, the doctor smoking while telling a patient to quit?
Perfect illustration. The authorities' own actions directly contradict their advice on that specific topic, undermining their credibility on that issue.
But on the flip side, if you have multiple independent astronomy experts all agreeing that the risk of a major comet strike soon is extremely low.
That's a much stronger, more reasonable appeal to collective expert authority, assuming they're basing it on shared data and models.
And the example of Bobby Parks claiming librarians were plotting against him, undermined by his known addiction and paranoia.
Right. His personal context was highly relevant to assessing the reliability of those extraordinary claims.
Okay. And just quickly, there's also an inverse ad hominem, praising someone to make their argument seem better.
Yeah, basically saying, this person is great, therefore their argument must be great. It could be fallacious. But, like regular ad hominem, context matters in things like letters of recommendation.
Praising someone's character is relevant.
Exactly, because their character and past performance are directly related to their suitability or future potential, which is what the letter is about.
Right. Okay, analogies. These can be super helpful for explaining things, making comparisons, but also tricky. Your sources broke them down a bit.
They did. You've got figurative analogies, more like metaphors.
Yep.
Critical thinking is like being a detective. Illustrative, but not really an argument.
Then deductive analogies,
Yeah.
based on a shared principle.
Yes, like that superintelligent space invaders wanting to eat humans thought experiment. It works by saying, if you accept principle X about humans, you must logically accept it applies to aliens too. But if you reject the underlying principle,
Like maybe you don't think intelligence justifies inflicting suffering.
right, if you reject that principle, the analogy falls apart. Its strength depends entirely on accepting that shared principle.
And then inductive analogies, drawing conclusions based on similarities.
These are more common in everyday arguments. The analogy comparing capital punishment to the risk of a speeding fire truck hitting someone.
It asks us to weigh potential benefits against unavoidable risks in both cases.
Exactly. It prompts us to think, are these situations similar enough in the relevant ways for the comparison to be strong? Do the benefits outweigh the risks similarly?
These often seem to touch on ethics, like the education healthcare as basic rights analogy, comparing them to other things we consider fundamental needs.
Right, or the Thomson violinist's thought experiment about abortion using an analogy to isolate the issue of bodily autonomy. Even simpler ones, like arguing for small university classes because the parking lots are empty.
Could be weak if the lots are empty for other reasons, like good public transport, maybe?
Exactly. The similarities might be superficial. Your sources had tons of examples, right? Marijuana versus alcohol legalization.
The shipwreck case, United States v. Holmes, arguing for the necessity of sacrificing some to save others.
Using an analogy of extreme situations. Even legal precedent works by analogy. The Ruggles v. Levine dog bite case looked at similar past cases to judge if the harm was foreseeable.
And the kids getting rewards, Julie for the shot, Johnny for the dentist, arguing for consistency based on similar situations.
Or the Teresa Valenti late paper case, is her situation analogous to the band members? Does fairness require treating them the same? And even defining words legally, like building in the Travis Carter breaking and entering case, involve comparing the unfinished structure to the concept of a building established in precedence.
So the bottom line with analogies is check the comparison.
Pretty much. They highlight similarities but ignore differences. Powerful for persuasion, great for understanding sometimes, but always examine, is the comparison fair? Are the similarities relevant? Are the differences being ignored important?
Okay. Now, your sources also dug into some specific argument types with common pitfalls. Slippery slope, dilemma, and golden mean. We hear these all the time.
We do. The slippery slope fallacy claims that taking one specific action will inevitably trigger a whole chain reaction of negative consequences, usually ending somewhere terrible.
But without showing how that chain reaction actually works.
Often, yes, without sufficient evidence for that inevitable slide. This is different from a legitimate argument that carefully outlines a clear, plausible causal sequence, like, say, dumping toxic PCBs will likely contaminate the water, harm fish, and impact human health downriver. That's tracing likely consequences.
But the claim that marijuana use inevitably leads to heroin addiction.
Classic fallacious slippery slope. The link isn't automatic or inevitable for most people, whereas arguing directly against heroin use because it's highly addictive and harmful, that's a different, more direct argument.
We saw this slippery slope thinking maybe in the oil company profit example. Criticizing high profits gets framed as inevitably leading to the collapse of the whole energy sector.
That could be presented that way, yeah. Or the argument that allowing medical marijuana will somehow inevitably lead to the legalization and widespread abuse of all drugs. It assumes steps that aren't necessarily connected.
Okay. Then dilemmas, presenting only two options.
Right. Dilemma arguments present a limited set, often just two and either, and argue that since one option is bad or false, the other must be chosen or true.
But sometimes there are more than two options.
Exactly. That's a false dilemma. A genuine dilemma presents the only real possibilities. Like a judge telling a jury, you must find the defendant either guilty beyond a reasonable doubt or not guilty. Those are the only legal verdicts available.
Okay.
But a false dilemma ignores other viable options. The scenario about the butler, either he's lying or he saw the murder. Well, maybe he was mistaken. Maybe he saw something else. There could be other explanations.
And the classic, we must either close the library or raise tuition.
Right. It ignores other possibilities, cut administrative costs, fundraise, find efficiency somewhere else. The Barbara Brent murder case in your materials presented a scenario that the defense framed as a dilemma for the jury, which might have been a false one.
But the Kevin Wiggins incompetent lawyer case seemed more like a genuine dilemma about legal strategy and representation.
It arguably presented a genuine, difficult choice, yes. And the debate around Guantanamo Bay is often framed as a dilemma. Keep it open or release potentially dangerous people, ignoring other possibilities, perhaps.
And finally, the golden mean fallacy. Just assuming the middle ground is always best.
Yeah, the idea that the moderate position between two extremes must be the correct one. Compromise is often good, but it's not automatically right.
Like the 18-year-old drinking age example. Seems moderate between, say, 16 and 21.
It might seem like a reasonable middle ground, but the best age depends on evidence about safety, maturity, etc., not just splitting the difference. And history shows extremes are sometimes right.
Copernicus saying the Earth orbits the sun. That was extreme then. Totally. Or advocating for the complete abolition of slavery, not just reform. Or understanding the Earth is billions, not thousands of years old. Sometimes the middle ground is just wrong.
So in a murder trial, maybe not guilty is the correct extreme, not some compromise verdict.
Exactly. If the evidence didn't prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, not guilty is the correct verdict, even if it's one end of the spectrum. And that jury deliberating on breaking, gentering, and arson, a compromise verdict, maybe finding guilty on one lesser charge just to agree, might not reflect the actual evidence for each separate charge.
So don't just assume moderation equals correctness. Evaluate each position on its own merits.
That's the key.
Okay, two more sneaky ones your sources highlighted. Begging the question and self-sealing arguments. These feel circular.
They often are. Begging the question, or circular reasoning, is when the argument's conclusion is just assumed in the premises.
Yep.
It doesn't actually provide any independent support.
Like the DA saying the defendant is guilty because he is guilty. Exactly. That doesn't prove anything. It just restates the claim. Yeah. Self-sealing arguments, sometimes called the no true Scotsman fallacy, are clever because they redefine terms to avoid any counterexamples.
Ah, the Scotsman who puts sugar on his porridge.
Right. The claim is, no true Scotsman puts sugar on his porridge. You find one who does. Ah, well, he's not a true Scotsman then. The definition shifts to protect the original claim. And we should also just briefly mention complex or loaded questions, the kind that sneak in an unproven assumption. Have you stopped beating your wife? Assumes you were beating her.
Gotcha. Okay, shifting to numbers. In this world of data overload, thinking critically about statistics seems more vital than ever. Your sources had some warnings.
Absolutely. Statistics are powerful, but easily misused or misinterpreted, intentionally or not. Understanding the difference between mean, median, and mode is crucial.
The different types of average.
Right. They can give very different pictures, especially if the data is skewed, like with income or, as in the tax cut example, how benefits are distributed. One type of average might sound good while hiding the real impact.
And statistical significance. Sample size. Control groups.
All essential. A small study showing a tiny improvement with a new cold medicine could easily be just random chance. You need a large enough sample, a proper control group getting a placebo, and a statistically significant difference to be more confident the effect is real.
And getting a truly representative sample for surveys is hard, right? The Edmonton rudeness example, or Ann Lander's parenting survey.
Very hard. Who chooses to respond? How are the questions phrased? All sorts of things can bias the results. You can't easily generalize from a self-selected group, like readers choosing to mail in a response.
So always ask, where do these numbers come from? How is the data collected? What do they really represent?
Exactly. Healthy skepticism towards statistics presented without context is always a good idea.
Okay, dipping into a bit more formal logic now. Your sources mentioned necessary and sufficient conditions. These seem helpful for untangling if-then relationships.
They are very helpful. A necessary condition is something that must be present for another thing to happen. It's required. Like maybe having oxygen is necessary for fire.
But oxygen alone isn't enough for fire.
Right. It's not sufficient. A sufficient condition is something that, if present, guarantees the other thing will happen. Like maybe scoring 95% in the final is sufficient to get an A in the class.
But maybe not necessary. You could get an A with 92% perhaps.
Precisely. Understanding this difference helps evaluate those if-then statements, conditionals like A, B, and avoid common fallacies.
Like assuming if the then part is true, the if part must have caused it.
That's affirming the consequent, a common fallacy. Or denying the antecedent, assuming if the if part is false, the then part must also be false. Your sources use examples like LeBron Durant scoring or the Rachel murder case to show how these invalid forms lead to wrong conclusions. Valid forms like modus ponens, if A then B, A is true, therefore B is true, and modus tollens, if A then B, B is false, therefore A is false, are reliable ways we reason.
Okay. Finally, our deep dive looked at scientific and causal reasoning, trying to figure out what causes what. So fundamental.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Randomized controlled experiments are the gold standard here. Comparing an experimental group to a control group randomly assigned.
But not always possible, right? Like studying smoking. You can't randomly assign people to smoke for 20 years.
Ethically impossible and practically difficult. So often we rely on prospective studies, like epidemiological ones, tracking groups over time, looking for correlations. But it's incredibly hard to control for all the other factors, diet, lifestyle, genetics, that might be the real cause.
The sources mentioned the shift from Ptolemy's Earth-centered universe model to Copernicus's sun-centered one, based on predictive power.
Largely, yes. The Copernican model made much more accurate predictions about planetary movements. Predictive success is a key feature of strong scientific theories.
And the importance of control groups again, and avoiding confirmation bias, actively trying to disprove your own hypothesis. The light therapy example showed that.
Crucial. It's easy to find evidence that seems to support what you already believe. Rigorous science requires trying to falsify your ideas. And then there's the troubling issue of suppressed research.
Companies hiding studies that show their products are ineffective or harmful. Vioxx, Paxil, Avandia, the examples were concerning.
Very concerning. It undermines the whole scientific process and public trust when unfavorable results are buried. And determining causality in complex areas like, say, scientific jury selection, does it actually work? Or the placebo effect is incredibly challenging.
Even eyewitness testimony, which seems so direct, it's prone to errors. Unconscious transference, photo bias.
Yes, memory is malleable, which has led to better procedures for police lineups, like sequential presentation instead of showing everyone at once to reduce relative judgments.
And one last fallacy here. Suppressed evidence. Deliberately leaving out key information.
Right. It's not about presenting false information, but about presenting only the information that supports your case while hiding relevant facts that contradict it.
Like the Shell gasoline platform aid ad or the Kenneth Leyenron stock example. Only telling part of the story.
Exactly. Or the Triumph versus Merit taste test, only reporting the results where Triumph won. It creates a misleading picture by omission. Resources like factcheck.org can be useful for digging into these half-truths. And really, throughout this whole discussion, especially with all those legal examples you brought in,
We've sort of been acting like jurors.
in a way, yes. You've been implicitly doing the work of a critical thinker, weighing evidence, spotting assumptions, evaluating the strength of arguments, just like a juror or anyone trying to make sense of complex information.
So to wrap this all up, this deep dive has really shown that critical thinking isn't just, passively soaking up information.
Not at all.
It's an active process. It involves getting clear on the issue, understanding argument structures, being alert for those fallacies,
Evaluating the reasons, the evidence, questioning assumptions.
and paying close attention to language, to statistics, to potential biases.
Absolutely. Ultimately, the ability to analyze information and arguments effectively is just a vital skill, not just for academics or lawyers, but for everyone in all parts of life, for making informed decisions, for understanding the world, for navigating this incredibly complex information landscape we live in.
Couldn't agree more. So now that you've got these tools and insights sharpened by looking at your own source materials, here's a final thought for you, the listener, to consider. What is one specific area of your life, maybe a recurring debate you have or a type of news you follow, where you'll now make an effort to pay closer attention to the reasoning being presented. Time to put these critical thinking skills into practice. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.